Not long ago, I packaged up my mother's floor loom and dragged it across an ocean to Yorkshire, where I've set it up in my home, and I've now woven some Yorkshire tweed on it. And it's amazing. I'm so pleased with it. And I documented the whole process for a video, but then I came to write the video script about it, and it's actually not that interesting. It's basically the same as my last video about weaving. I wound a warp, I beamed it, I threaded the loom with a gold merino wool and a herringbone twill pattern. I wove about 8 meters of cloth in a lovely red merino weft, followed by a lovely blue silk wool mix, and finished with some fancy treadling to make a diamond pattern in some blue wool acrylic I found at a charity shop. I cut it off the loom, chucked it in a warm wash to see what would happen. Turned out okay, shrunk a bit, but I ironed it lovely and flat, and here it is. It's luscious. It's so lovely, but it's not enough new and interesting content for a video. So instead, I'm going to give you a flyover explanation of how weaving works in general. Here is a list of terms you will hopefully understand by the end of this video. According to my beloved Wikipedia, weaving is a method of textile production in which two distinct sets of yarns or threads are interlaced at right angles to form a fabric or cloth, which I think is both succinct and accurate. It's not knitting or crochet or felting or braiding or netting or any other method of making string into cloth. Those are all distinct and separate techniques. Weaving is the one where you have a warp, that's the long parallel threads stretched between point A and point B, and a weft, that's the bit you interlace with the warp to make the cloth. Weft, by the way, is the past participle of weave, like left, to leave. Eh? Thanks, Wikipedia. I suppose weaving probably started back in the mists of prehistory with grasses or reeds rather than string, since those materials hold themselves up on their own and can be woven into baskets or shoes or floor mats without any aid of complex tools. But it won't have been long before somebody wound some string between two sticks and called it a warp, and then started interlacing some more string crosswise, calling it a weft, and there it is. Weaving, pretty much as we still know it, was born. Let's look at warp then. A warp is a set of parallel threads stretched between two sticks of some kind, possibly wound around one of them to take up the excess if it's a really long warp. It varies exactly how it's mounted, but one way or another you've got to have a bunch of parallel threads and they've got to be under some kind of tension. They can't be floppy. There are comparatively high-tech ways to do that, like my floor loom, which involves a warp wound onto a warp beam, stretched between a back beam and a breast beam, and then onto a cloth beam, which I can wind forward as I weave to collect the cloth. To provide tension, the whole setup requires a break on the warp beam and a ratchet and pawl on the cloth beam. So I can wind it forward until the warp is under the right amount of tension and let it off when necessary. Other less high-tech tensioning devices are available, like rocks with holes in, which you may have seen in museums. Seriously, just tying rocks to the bottom of bundles of warp threads and hanging them from a stick above. It's a totally legitimate way of tensioning a warp. Been happening since the Neolithic era at least, and still happening in the 1950s in some rural places in Northern Europe. Still happening today at a Ren fair near you. Another very low-tech tensioning method is to tie one end of the warp to the nearest tree and the other end to a belt round your middle and just lean back. This one's great because it requires very little equipment and is very portable. Great for when you're herding goats in the mountains or sitting outside your van at the Ren fair. Anyway, warp tension needs to be variable because as you weave, the warp gets deflected each time it intersects with some weft, so it gets slowly, incrementally tighter. The more of it is slightly scrunched as it turns into cloth. So all looms, however high or low tech, need a way of managing the amount of tension in the warp. Weft tension is also a thing, especially on a floor loom like this, because weft threads deflect as they settle into the warp, so they can have a tendency to pull the edges of the fabric in. You can counteract that a bit by putting the weft in on a bit of a diagonal before beading, so there's a little bit of extra length on each pass to get eaten up in the deflection. You can also use a temple, which is a device for stretching your just woven cloth laterally to counteract the shrinkage. Okay, let's talk about ways to get the weft efficiently to interlace with the warp. In primary school, you may have just done this with your fingers, poking a bit of ribbon in and out, but even at age 10, you probably will have had a sense that there were potential drawbacks to this method. It is actually not that dissimilar from tapestry weaving. Not that kind of tapestry, that's actually embroidery, not weaving. Tapestry involves building up areas of weft kind of freeform on a vertical warp, so the thread doesn't necessarily have to go all the way to the end of the warp, and you can build really intricate patterns and follow a cartoon mounted behind the work, or just follow your bliss if you want. It's a very versatile method in terms of the finished pattern. One potential drawback to this technique, though, is that it's very slow. If you want to build up a cloth more quickly, you might start looking at ways to form a shed. A shed is the space between the up warp threads and the down warp threads, which lets you pass the weft through without having to poke it round each thread individually. On a floor loom like this, it's done by having threaded each warp thread through a heddle on one of two or more harnesses, which can be raised or lowered. by stepping on treadles. The simplest loom of this type is a two harness, which allows half the threads to be pulled up and the other half down, and the weft passed through, and then reversed, and the weft passed back through. This kind of weave is called a plain weave, and it's versatile and durable and useful, but not the only kind of weave. Things like twill, satin, and brocade require more harnesses to create more different options for which threads go up and which threads go down at any given time. And in centuries past, there was a kind of mechanical inventions arms race to figure out ever more elaborate methods of raising and lowering ever greater numbers of harnesses in order to create ever more complicated patterns. All this innovation ultimately culminated in the jacquard loom, which just did away with harnesses altogether and raised individual threads on individual heddles using punch cards to dictate which ones were up at any given pass. And if that reminds you a bit of early computer programming, well spotted, you are not wrong. Do a quick internet search for Babbage and Lovelace, because the smartphone in your pocket has its beginnings right here in weaving. But I seriously digress. So let's drag it back to some much less complicated ways to form a shed. A minute ago, heddles were wires with an eye in the middle, suspended on harnesses on a floor loom, but actually a heddle is just any method of holding one warp thread separate from any other in order to lift it and form a shed. On an upright warp-weighted loom in the Anglo-Saxon style, the warp is set up to hang with half the threads forward and half back by default, but the back threads are tied with a little string loop to a stick, which you can prop to reverse the shed. So there are two alternating sheds depending on whether the stick is propped or not. String loop heddles are also how an inkle loom forms a shed, but in this case the warp itself is wound differently, with some threads going straight from peg A to peg B, and others being diverted over peg C, but held in line with a little string heddle. This leaves half the threads rigid, and the other half can be pushed up and down to form the two necessary sheds. This method is another good one for the Ren Fair because it takes only a small portable loom and is easily explainable to curious bystanders. A slightly weird outlier in the shed formation game is card weaving, or tablet weaving, where you thread your warp through cards with 4 holes in them and lay them together so that some threads are up and some threads are down. You can turn the cards forward or backward to change the shed. You're still passing the weft through the shed in the same way as with other weaving, but the way the cards twist the warp adds a slight diagonal property to the pattern, and the 4 threads per card mean that you can make really intricate designs, which would be harder to create with heddle weaving techniques. It's a bit crazy to get your head around and much more difficult to conceptualize than plain weave, but it's a fun challenge for the spatially adept, and I think it's the best choice for weaving really detailed, intricate patterns on narrow bands. Some historical weaving methods actually involve combining the string heddles on a stick technique and a set of cards on the edge of the warp, so you get a decorative and extra robust selvage. Next, we move on to shuttles, which are tools for holding the weft as it's being woven. In tapestry weaving, you can sometimes get away with just passing a wad of yarn back and forth, but in most other cases, you'll want a shuttle to hold the long length of the weft thread to make it easier to pass back and forth. On a floor loom, you'd typically have a boat shuttle of some kind with a bobbin or a pern to feed the weft thread evenly as the shuttle is thrown through the shed across the warp. On my loom, I chuck a shuttle from hand to hand. It's just smooth bottomed to sail across, but some shuttles are given little wheels in an effort to reduce friction. For other weaving techniques, the shuttle might be as simple as a flat piece of wood with notches, or even a stick to wind the yarn round, anything to keep your length of unused weft in order while you work. Elongated wooden shuttles with notches at the end are popular for inkle and card weaving, and netting shuttles are cool. They have a slightly fancier way of loading the thread, but they all pretty much work the same. You just pass it back and forth while weaving and wind off a bit more when you need to. Weft needs to be beaten into place on a warp as it's added to keep it even and tight. On a floor loom like this, it's usually done with a built-in beater which holds a reed, which is like a steel comb that thunks against each thread as it's added and tightens the weaving as you go. On a tapestry loom, you might use a comb beater to just beat the bits you need to, since very often you're not putting a thread all the way across the piece. For inkle and card weaving, you can use the shuttle to beat, which is more efficient if you do it after changing the shed, so the deflection of the warp helps snug each piece of weft into the last. On a warp-weighted loom, there's a type of beater that's basically a wooden sword. It lets you do the same thing, but across a greater area. On any cloth, the harder you beat, the stiffer it will be. Yeah, so that's weaving in a nutshell. Once you start learning about it, and I hope you will, you'll find that there's quite a lot of glossed over here. There are lots of other cool variations and advancements in technology, especially interesting stuff that occurred during the 18th and 19th centuries, like flying shuttles and drop boxes and dobbies and spinning jennies. My home region of West Yorkshire, and Northern England more broadly, was right in the thick of it during all the exciting upheaval of the Industrial Revolution. I can really get nerdy about the textile industry's role in the socioeconomic changes that shaped our modern world, but not now, not today. Today, I need to figure out what I'm going to do with my awesome, gorgeous, delicious hand-woven tweed.